As therapists, we know the work doesn't end when the session does. There's scheduling, notes, billing, and insurance follow ups waiting for you. That's why we're big fans of tools that actually make the admin side easier. Simple Practice is an all in one EHR built specifically for therapists. So everything lives in one place and you can focus on your clients. Learn more at simplepractice.com/therapy reimagined.
This episode is sponsored by The Receptionist for iPad, a visitor management system that allows you to easily check in clients and take your time back. Learn more by visiting thereceptionist.com/MTSG and get your first month free.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt Widhalm and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that go on in our work, the things that go on in our professions. And this is a special episode. It's one that we didn't necessarily have on our content calendar, but one of the wonderful things about being in the content creation business in 2026 is we have all kinds of plans, and then the world changes around us, and we need to put out some of our viewpoints on things, hopefully in help of therapists. And this episode's need is brought to us by the state of Texas, and specifically Attorney General Ken Paxton and KP 0518. This is a statement that was made by the Attorney General that said that with the results of previous Senate Bill 14, are going to now apply to therapists. And what has previously been understood to be about medical providers providing gender-affirming treatments to youth in the state of Texas and a ban on that. This statement, this general opinion by Ken Paxton, which was released early in March of 2026, depending on when you're listening to this as a reference point. But this statement says that this also considers mental health clinicians as being part of the healthcare pipeline, and providing gender-affirming care could be considered child abuse and a criminal act, and has a risk of therapists who are working in public agencies to lose public funding for those agencies, and risk of loss of licensure regardless of the place of where you work, whether it be in private practice or in agencies. So we are here to discuss what your options are as this directive comes out, how it's going to be interpreted, as well as our recommendations for what you should do. So I'm going to preview my thing of this, Katie, my recommendation, which is Texas mental health providers to protect yourself and your practice. You should stop working with people under the age of 18. I know that I am generally known for my humor, my sarcasm. This is a legitimate recommendation coming from me.
Before I respond to that recommendation, which I will put on record that I disagree with, I want to just acknowledge that we know that there's everything in the world going on, and that this may seem irrelevant to some folks who are concerned about the war and about a lot of other things that are very present. That's why we're putting this episode out. We're turning it around in the fastest time frame that we've done. And because this is for Texas, it may feel like this is only for Texas therapists. But in doing some research for this episode, there are so many states with broad bans across the whole country that do not allow for gender-affirming care. And much of it seems to be framed around the medical elements of surgery or hormones or those types of things. And we have some episodes where we talk a little bit about care for trans teens, and we'll link to those in the show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. But even if it's not in your state, even if you are not practicing in Texas, I think that many of us are going to start having these concerns as we continue to see more of this bias, harm towards trans folks, especially trans kids. And so I want to say that this is an episode we're turning on very quickly, and so we're not even going to have social media posts until next week. And it may be a little bit more raw because we're editing it quickly. We're trying to put it out quickly. And so please engage with us. Please feel free to share with us your opinions on this and to share this with other folks, because unless they're subscribers who are on their podcast apps on most days, they may not even know this is happening, that we're putting this out there. So, okay, so back to what we were talking about. In what I've read about this, Curt, the biggest concern from a lot of folks that are youth advocates as well as trans advocates is that this is going to do exactly what you're suggesting people do, which is going to limit mental health care for folks who absolutely need it. And yes, it is self-protective, but it is not something that I think is sustainable for the youth of Texas. And I also recognize that choosing to practice with kids, especially trans and gender nonconforming kids in Texas, is risky. I think it is worth the effort. So I want us to talk through the issues that we see, the concerns that are being raised, so that we can provide folks across the spectrum of what their practices are, kind of a plain vanilla, I work with kids and teens versus I am a specialist in trans and gender nonconforming kiddos. I think we want to make sure that there's an understanding to the best of our ability of what has been said here, what the implications are. And I think overall the takeaway, if you want it early, is talk to your own attorney, talk to your professional association. But we're going to talk through some of the biggest challenges that we see when looking at this. So where do you want to start, Curt? What are the first things that you think are most important for us to lay the groundwork here?
One of the attorney generals, and I'm choosing not to repeat his name any more than I absolutely have to, but one of his statements in this 7-page opinion that we'll include in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com specifically interprets a section of this Senate Bill 14 language, the word facilitating. And so the language of this bill talks about facilitating gender transition. And the Attorney General's opinion specifically states in this opinion that mental health professionals are going to be included in the enforcement of the law that resulted from this bill. Now, to me, in reading the Attorney General's opinion, facilitation is vague. It's probably intentionally broad. And this is so broad that it doesn't necessarily mean that therapists who are only referring clients to hormones or writing letters that are consistent with WPATH standards that would be in violation, not just referring to clinics that are outside of the state of Texas. Those are things that are already against the law. And what this facilitation could really look like is even just providing affirmative talk therapy. That the political nature of where Texas seems to lie, at least the government, is that some of the interpretations that I'm seeing of this is that if a child expresses to a therapist, I don't feel really like a boy, if the therapist doesn't challenge that, they could be found to be guilty of violating this law. That this would say that therapists have to state, you were born a boy, you are a boy, and really reaffirming that what a assigned gender at birth, assigned sex at birth, is the gender that that child is supposed to be. And so this is falling just short of mandated conversion therapy.
As a therapist, your work extends far beyond the therapy hour. There's the administrative load, scheduling, documentation, billing, insurance, follow-ups, all of the essential tasks that happen before and after the clinical work you're truly passionate about. We know how quickly that admin work can pile up. Simple Practice is an all-in-one electronic health record designed specifically for therapists. With HIPAA-compliant tools and high-trust certification, it helps you avoid juggling multiple systems or cutting corners just to keep your practice running smoothly. Everything you need lives in one place: scheduling, notes, billing, insurance, secure client communication, and automated appointment reminders.
And if you're starting or scaling your practice, Simple Practice also offers credentialing services to simplify the insurance enrollment process, which can otherwise be a huge hurdle. We appreciate having systems that are built specifically for therapists, not retrofitted from somewhere else. Ready to simplify your practice? Start with a 7-day free trial and get 50% off your first 4 months at simplepractice.com/therapy reimagined. That's simplepractice.com/therapy reimagined.
The other piece to that I feel very concerned about and cautious about also feels like a mandate for child abuse reporting. So even if I'm not commenting on the client saying, I don't align with the gender that I was assigned at birth, if parents are supporting gender-affirming services, that potentially is something that would require a child abuse report by a clinician. So the issues here are very legal in nature. Can you actually do gender identity discussions? Can you do gender-affirming care at all? Just the conversations about it. What seems very clear is no letters, no referrals, no facilitation of social transition necessarily, although I think that's a hard thing to prove, the social transition part. What does that even mean when you're talking about a state that already has a lot of these things already in place? So I don't know what a therapist would be doing that would be above and beyond a kid just deciding to socially transition themselves. But the child abuse comment is especially troubling because of not only could I be accused of child abuse, I am supposed to report it. And if I fail to report it, that can also be an issue with my license. So I hear all of that and I recognize those things are risks. Those are risks that folks face all the time. What we do in our therapy room is confidential. How we operate is at least some folks are trying to claim it's free speech. Some folks are saying that it's based on evidence-based practices, which conversion therapy is not, and gender-affirming care is. So it feels very muddy, and it feels like even though it could be gigantic amounts of money to get litigated and potentially locked up or whatever those concerns are, it doesn't seem likely that an individual provider who is providing care would have that risk. And I understand, do you want to be the one? But I feel like there are times when it's important enough to take the risk.
So you're bringing up a couple of points that I want to hit, and so if I forget them now, I think that I will hit them at various points throughout
Okay.
the rest of the episode here. So in most states, there's limits of confidentiality, and what the Attorney General is saying is that this is no longer confidential discussion with a therapist, and so this is putting therapists at risk of being charged with failure to report child abuse. And the Attorney General has previously argued that gender affirming care constitutes child abuse, as you're saying. And so if a therapist is providing it, they're also now contributing to potentially being charged with child abuse themselves. And that is an incredibly delicate situation that people who are trying to use science and use evidence are, as you're outlining, gender affirming care is science based, it's evidence based. This directly puts therapists at a space where the standard of care conflicts with the law. And in Texas, they are now explicitly threatening license revocation over science.
How would that happen? How would that come to the attention of the powers that be?
So I work with children in my practice, and I trust the kids that I work with to accurately represent what we do in the therapy room, approximately 30%. So let's take a fictional child. Let's call them Jamie. Little Jamie is in therapy. is potentially expressing, I don't feel inside like what my assigned gender at birth was. Jamie is incredibly knowledgeable of all of the terms here, but
Yes. Of course.
Jamie, even in all of Jamie's wisdom, says, I know that this is confidential. You're my safe therapist. You're my safe person. Jamie goes out into their life and talks about, I have the greatest therapist ever. And then a little bit later, Jamie starts to do some social transition stuff. Jamie maybe starts to change pronouns. Jamie maybe starts to try on some different clothes. And nosy neighbor, nosy teacher who is very much in support of this kind of law and this kind of interpretation says, I know Jamie has a therapist and I know that Jamie is socially transitioning. This could be child abuse. And that person could be reporting to wherever the child abuse reporting agencies are in Texas. So I don't expect Jamie in this situation to be able to have that wherewithal to be able to say, you know what, I'm not talking about my therapy over and over to being questioned by social workers, policemen, school personnel, anybody who's very interested in proving a point that this law needs to make therapists be an example of they are the ones who are facilitating this transition and the very, very first step of creating gender transition.
So then it would come down to consents beyond, to the point that that's needed. And I can't imagine the family consenting to having their treatment records put forward. There's documentation, even if it is taken, because, hey, this now has become a legal issue. And so there's documentation that would support neutral care. I understand what you're saying, and maybe I shouldn't assume that the rule of law applies in the world, but getting to a place where I have illegally provided gender-affirming care, it feels like that's a stretch. There would not be evidence if I documented appropriately, if I'm following the confidentiality rules, and the family is doing whatever it is that they do. It seems to me that that would be very challenging to actually charge me with something or to convict me of something and to remove my license if I've been a cautious clinician that is appropriately documented and went along with the best practices in the profession.
So I am not an expert on Texas law. By any means. So hopefully somebody from Texas can reach out to us and say, I am an expert on Texas law. And
Yes.
we will post whatever follow-ups on our social media to be able to say, here's where we were right or here's where we were wrong in this episode. But hiding notes, hiding what you're doing in your notes is potentially giving the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council a secondary reason to revoke your license. And one of the things that I see in the disciplinary cases that I typically follow, mostly in California, you and I serve on an ethics committee where when we look at documentation and we say, this is pretty terrible documentation, it's kind of the Al Capone, like the tax man will get you. In this case, it might be our documentation that gets it. And this is potentially looking at record tampering in addition to illegal therapy.
Well, and I understand if people are lying about what they're doing, but if somebody's working with a kiddo that's a teen that appropriately would be talking about identity concerns, would be talking about even gender dysphoria and talking about how those things are being resolved, if the documentation is accurate but does not suggest gender-affirming care, to me, I feel like I've done my responsibility on both sides. Appropriate documentation and not writing letters, not doing referrals to whatever. And I acknowledge that I'm suggesting doing substandard care. But I feel like substandard care is better than zero care.
Your time is valuable. Whether you're hyper-focused on admin tasks like billing or simply trying to make a cup of coffee between appointments, constant interruptions can derail your entire day. This episode is sponsored by the Receptionist for iPad, a digital check-in system that eliminates the need to walk back and forth from your office to the waiting room to see if your next appointment has arrived.
Clients or patients can securely check in for their appointments, and you'll be immediately notified by text, email, or your preferred channel. Break free from interruptions and make the most of your time. Start a 14-day free trial of The Receptionist for iPad by going to thereceptionist.com/MTSG. Make sure to start your trial with that link, and you'll also get your first month free if you decide to sign up.
For all of the times that we have talked about therapy is political, I'd never imagined that this would be the way that it would make it most obvious to everyone possible, that this is politics making therapy political.
Yeah.
Really, most of this is going to come down to how much risk are you willing to tolerate as a therapist? Because if this is looking at, okay, I'm doing something that the state could potentially look at me for doing as a felony, then not only is it that I have the risk of working with this client and dealing with that headache, my malpractice insurance might also not cover me, because most malpractice insurance policies are going to have a subsection in there that says exclusion of illegal acts clauses. So if you're doing this, you might be completely on the hook yourself if your insurance company says you came too close to the sun, Icarus. You are on your own. And that is a whole nother level of risk of even trying to defend yourself here. And again, this is not just kind of a slap on the wrist, citation, expensive fine. This is jail that we're talking about.
Again, if they can prove it. I understand the risk is there. I understand that they are very motivated. But if I'm providing therapy for depression and anxiety, for challenges within the system that they're operating within, that whether it's they're getting bullied at school, whatever it is, the typical issues that kids face, I'm not performing child abuse.
But are you willing to even go in that space? Because you're talking about having to defend yourself, potentially into the millions of dollars. The Attorney General's office in Texas has already been suing individual providers, granted on the medical side at this point, but there's already lawsuits against Dr. Mei Chi Lau and Dr. Hector Granados, and those are millions of dollars in penalties. This is not just the Attorney General's office going after big hospitals and big clinics. They're going after individual practitioners.
Yeah.
And so the point of if they can prove it is valid, but do you have the time, the monetary backing, and potentially the loss of ability to even generate income while you're trying to defend yourself?
Probably not. And that is the assumption that I would be targeted. And I don't see how I would be targeted if I have good documentation. I'm following the letter of the law, which is I can do therapy. I just can't help someone transition. And I don't see this being as big of a risk as what you're describing. I do think that there are folks who are at big risk. And many folks with lived experience, potentially trans therapists themselves, who will continue to provide letters. They will continue to provide referrals. They will continue to document in their documentation that they're doing gender-affirming care, which, let me be very clear, I think is important and necessary. And I think those are the folks who are most at risk. Those are the folks who are going to be targeted, unfortunately. And I wish I could protect those folks. But a therapist like you or me, we're cis folks doing work with families and kids, we would not be targeted because our documentation would be pristine. We would be doing maybe a little bit substandard care because we would not do the letters and the referrals and the specific WPATH standard care. We would be doing regular care for kiddos. And so I don't love it. But I think we do need to have clinicians helping kids to navigate the system. And you're talking about 0 kids, not just no kids that are coming to you with gender dysphoria or who are trans or gender nonconforming. You're saying no kids because any kids are going to have a possibility of having some sort of a gender concern or gender differences. And so we're saying a whole generation of kids in Texas are not able to get care for depression, anxiety, family concerns because of this concern that I feel like, yeah, there's a couple of doctors who were doing gender confirming medical procedures, not who were saying, oh, here, let me give you a referral. This isn't the fireworks. They're doing big fireworks to, I think, scare clinicians, getting folks to comply in advance. And I think that's a big concern to me.
I personally, morally agree that these children should be able to have the kind of treatment that you and I speak about, that is backed by evidence, that is backed by everything that we've pointed to several times, not only in this episode, but over the course of the history of our podcast. All of the work that we've done, I think personal morals align with what you're talking about. It aligns with our professional ethics. And part of what I think you're referring to here is client safety and the ability for kids to be able to get safe treatment. When we're talking about client safety, we also have to think about if we're risking these kids being involved in multi-year disciplinary investigations, having to be interviewed over and over about where their gender may be and the potential for future trauma that can happen to them through this investigation, there's not a clear path in any direction where it is entirely safe for kids who are facing these issues. Now, I'm hoping that if there is enough pressure put on by therapists to be able to say, we're not working with kids anymore, and being able to help the kids and the families affected by this, not only these children, but all children, that this will put enough pressure on the Texas legislature to clarify this and to clarify that what their intention was when they crafted SB14 in the first place. And all of the trans activist groups and LGBTQ plus activist groups that were working with the legislature when they were writing it, saying, hey, is this going to affect mental health professionals? And even a lot of the more conservative people working on that Senate bill and voting for it said, no, this isn't going to apply to mental health professionals. That it puts the pressure on them to actually have to come in and clarify this, because as it stands with the Attorney General's interpretation of this, it's a lot of risk to your individual license. And there's no guarantee that it's actually going to protect the client safety that you're talking about here.
So Texas clinicians stop working with kids as a protest, as a self-protection, as a little bit of both. I see that as an option. I just don't agree with it.
I mean, this is advocacy as a collective effort. That this is something that is not just a recommendation for individual therapists to say, I am making the stand individually, but to also convey to the populations that you work with that you're saying, due to these recent developments, and specifically KP0518 and the implementation of SB14 under the Attorney General's office, the regulatory landscape for mental health professionals working with youth is too risky. And it defines that therapy has to be something that is harmful to people. And under the current interpretation, I can't do this. I mean, everybody should talk to your own attorneys in this, but as far as being able to even potentially end your relationships with children who very much need this, there's national support organizations that I would direct them to. There's legal resources, but I would also be encouraging in a wrap-up session with kids and their parents to be able to say, you need to reach out to your representatives to get this changed, because we're going to see the same kind of brain drain that we've seen from other states with typically medical doctors around the ways that abortion laws have been written in some states, that this is kind of a sign that for individual practitioners to be able to practice in an evidence-based way, you can't follow this law and practice in an evidence-based way. And it's entirely up to you and the amount of risk that you want to do.
The options suck.
Yes.
There are no good options here. I think what likely will happen is that folks will stop working with trans and gender nonconforming kiddos, but will continue working with kids who present as the sex assigned at birth. And I think it will continue to provide very disparate care for some of the teens who need it the most. I think that there are lots of great organizations who are working to try to address these issues. We'll find those and put those as links in the show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. I think each person needs to think about their risk. I think each person needs to think about how they're going to operate. I understand in theory what you're saying, Curt, around just removing care for kids in Texas. I think that one by one, clinicians may do that, but that will impact kids. And I get short-term harm for long-term gain, and it will impact folks who that's their livelihood. And some clinicians will not be able to do that because that's completely destroying their private practices in a afternoon. And so I think my hope is that there are things that move forward in Texas where there's clarity that helps to create more space for therapy and clinical work with all kids, including trans and gender nonconforming kids. This is truly awful, and I think each person's going to have to make their own choice, and so I'm not sure that collective action around provision of care is possible.
I have never had a client brought into me, a minor client, who the presenting issues or the myriad of presenting issues at the time of starting treatment was for gender affirming care. I don't advertise my practice that way, but every trans child that I've ever worked with, what I'm saying is, didn't start out at the beginning of therapy saying, I'm a trans child.
Sure.
This was after long and trusting relationships. And so my basis for this recommendation is, you can't just stop working with trans kids to follow this law, because every child that you work with could potentially become a trans kid. And they should get the support that they need. But I'm again going to come back to the Attorney General's opinion explicitly naming therapists as clinical gatekeepers, that this is not just about the medical transition, but this is about even the affirmation of thoughts is the initiation of harm, according to the Attorney General. He's not just banning surgery, he's banning the thought process that leads to it. If you don't want this risk at all in your practice, I don't see any possible way that you can work with minors in Texas and not put yourself at least at some kind of risk. And so that's the basis where I see three options. I see stop working with kids. That's my protect your license recommendation. I see follow this law and provide harmful therapy. And I see break the law and put yourself at risk. Yeah.
So I want to say how I see those options. One is provide no therapy and protect your license. Provide mediocre therapy or go all out. I think, or I guess there can be also provide harmful therapy, provide mediocre therapy, or continue to provide gender affirming care. I think it's the way you're framing it in my mind is too all or nothing.
I disagree. I think your idea of mediocre therapy and a very intentionally guided Texas justice system that may be targeting therapists as part of this, and their idea of mediocre therapy are still miles apart. And so unless you have the backing, the financial backing to put yourself out there, whether you're in that third category of people who just say, you know what, this law be damned, I am going to practice in the way that I always have, and I'm going to use science and reason and basic humanity to treat kids who need to be treated. But if you're in that middle zone, you're still at risk. And unless you have the financial backing to potentially get in trouble, go through the investigation process, have your license revoked, be able to go through the incredibly conservative Texas court system to be able to fight for your right to do this, appeal it to the Fifth Circuit Court, which is the most conservative of the appeals courts in the country. And then, even then, if you're still able to push it to the Supreme Court, which currently at this point is tending to rule against arguments like this, and is a 6-3 supermajority. So you're looking at potentially 5 or more years and a couple of $1 million to be able to get to the right answer, at least according to Curt and Katie and our modern therapist standards. But if you're not ready to be that therapist with that backing and relying on donations while you can't practice, you have to make a decision that is best for you.
And I think that's where we need to finish, is that this is something where obviously Curt and I have very different opinions on this. So even well-meaning people can vary on their opinions on this. And so talk to your attorneys, talk to your professional association, talk to your colleagues and see what people are doing, and make this decision on your own, because obviously there's the legal and ethical elements of it that aren't particularly aligned. There's the moral elements of this, and there's also your practical elements, which is, do you have money to not work now? Do you have money to potentially not work later? And what is it that is going to be able to take care of you during this horrific law in Texas?
We're going to put the statement by the Attorney General in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com, along with a couple of other articles that we looked over to prepare for this episode. We'll probably continue to post more resources in our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group, and please continue to stay in touch with us about this, especially if you are one of our listeners in Texas, and how this is going to continue to unfold for you in your practice. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhalm with Katie Vernoy.
If you're looking to streamline your practice, we recommend checking out Simple Practice. Start your 7-day free trial and get 50% off your first 4 months at simplepractice.com/therapy reimagined. That's simplepractice.com/therapy reimagined.
With the receptionist for iPad, there's no more walking back and forth to check the waiting room for your next appointment. Receive an instant notification that your next client has arrived securely and privately. Visit thereceptionist.com/MTSG and get your first month free.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.